Sometimes the greatest horrors come disguised as simple medical calls. Doc Avery had delivered babies, set broken bones, and held dying hands for 40 years in Fairwater, but he'd never seen anything like what was growing on Eli Granger's neck. When the cowboy rode into town with those strange bumps, Doc figured it was just another infection from the trail. He was wrong. What burst from those boils wasn't blood or pus. It was something alive, something that brought back terrible memories of his late wife and a sickness that once swept through their town. Years ago, the people of Fairwater sealed an old well and swore never to speak of what they found there. But what really happened at that cursed, well, all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fairwater's dusty Main Street as Doc Avery stepped onto his clinic's weathered porch, clutching his leather medical journal like he had every morning for the past 4 decades. The book's worn cover had witnessed more births, deaths, and mysteries than any man should carry alone. At 73, Marcus Avery still moved with the purposeful gait of a doctor who understood that in frontier towns, there was no such thing as retirement only, the gradual passing of knowledge to younger hands that rarely came. Fairwater hadn't changed much since. He'd arrived as a young physician fresh from medical school back east. The same wooden storefronts lined the street, their paint faded by countless seasons of harsh sun and bitter wind. The same families occupied the same houses, though many faces had aged beyond recognition, and too many others had been claimed by the unforgiving demands of frontier life. Population had dwindled from nearly 300 souls to barely 200, as younger folks sought opportunities in bigger towns with better prospects. The town's character remained constant, a place where neighbors knew each other's troubles and shared each other's burdens without fanfare or expectation of reward. These were people who understood that survival depended on community, that harsh winters and unpredictable seasons demanded cooperation over competition. Doc Avery had grown to love this about Fairwater, even as he mourned the slow exodus of families seeking easier lives elsewhere. His own story was woven deeply into the town's fabric. He'd arrived with grand plans and youthful optimism, intending to spend a few years gaining experience before establishing a practice in a larger city. Then he'd met Sarah Mitchell at a church social, and suddenly those plans seemed less important than the gentle smile of a schoolteacher who shared his love of books and his desire to help people. They'd married within a year, built a life together in the house behind the clinic, and dreamed of growing old surrounded by children and grandchildren. Those dreams had died with Sarah 20 years ago, claimed by a mysterious illness that had swept through Fairwater like wildfire. Doc still carried the guilt of failing to save her, of watching helplessly as the woman he loved succumbed to symptoms that defied every medical text he'd studied. The epidemic had taken 12 lives in total before it mysteriously ended, leaving Doc to wonder if he'd somehow missed something crucial, some treatment or diagnosis that might have made the difference. Since Sarah's death, the clinic had become both his sanctuary and his prison. He'd thrown himself into his work with renewed dedication, determined that no other family would suffer the loss he'd experienced. His reputation for compassion and skill had spread throughout the territory, earning him the respect of ranchers and townspeople alike. Yet late at night, when the clinic was quiet and the town slept, he still heard Sarah's voice in the empty rooms, still felt the weight of questions that would never be answered. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke his morning reverie. Doc looked up to see Eli Granger's familiar figure riding slowly down the street. But something was wrong with the cowboy's usual confident posture. Eli sat hunched in his saddle, one hand pressed against the side of his neck, his weathered face creased with pain and confusion. Eli Granger was the kind of man Fairwater produced: tough, reliable, and honest to a fault. At 54, he'd spent most of his adult life driving cattle across the territory, earning respect through hard work and fair dealing. He was a bachelor who'd never found time for romance between long cattle drives, content with the freedom of the trail and the camaraderie of fellow cowboys. His return to Fairwater always brought news from other towns and territories, making him a welcome sight at the local saloon where men gathered to hear stories from beyond their small corner of the world. But this morning, Eli looked nothing like the confident trail boss who'd left town 6 weeks ago, with a herd bound for the railroad markets up north. His clothes were dusty from hard travel, but that was normal after a long drive. What concerned Doc was the way Eli favored his left side, the careful way he moved his head, and the obvious discomfort etched across features that had weathered countless storms without complaint. "Morning, Doc," Eli called out, his voice carrying a rough edge that spoke of pain carefully controlled. "Reckon I might need you to take a look at something." Doc descended the clinic steps with practiced ease, his medical instincts already engaged. "Lie down, Eli. What seems to be troubling you?" Eli dismounted with obvious care, wincing as the movement jarred whatever was bothering him. Up close, Doc could see the problem clearly, a series of raised bumps along Eli's neck and jawline. Some as large as robin's eggs, others smaller but equally angry-looking. The skin around them was inflamed and tender, giving Eli's normally tanned complexion an unhealthy pallor. "Started about a week ago," Eli explained, following Doc into the clinic's familiar interior. "Thought maybe I'd picked up some kind of bug bite or reaction to something on the trail. But they keep getting bigger, and the pain's getting worse. Never seen anything quite like it." Doc's examination room smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a combination that had become as much a part of Fairwater's character as the church, the bell or the general store's creaking floorboards. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating the medical instruments and bottles of medicine that represented the town's best defense against injury and illness. "Let's get you up on the table," Doc said, washing his hands in the basin, with the thorough care that had become second nature. "How was the drive? Any trouble along the way?" "Smooth as could be expected," Eli replied, settling onto the examination table with careful movements. "Good weather, no stampedes, fair price. At market. Only unusual thing was that water hole about 2 days out from here. Cattle didn't want to drink from it, kept shying away like something spooked them." Doc's hands stilled for a moment as he dried them. "Which water hole was that?" "You know, the one sits in that little valley with the cottonwoods, maybe 10 miles. Northwest of town. Stream runs down from the hills, forms a nice pool. Always stop there on the way back from drives. Good place to rest the animals and fill the water barrels." A chill ran down Doc's spine as he realized which location Eli was describing, the valley with the sealed well. The place where Sarah used to pick wildflowers before her illness began. The area the town council had declared off-limits 20 years ago, though few people remembered why anymore. "Did you drink from that water?" Doc asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral as he began his examination. "Course I did. Been drinking from that stream for 20 years. Never had any trouble before." Eli winced as Doc's gentle fingers probed the largest of the bumps. Water tasted a bit different this time, kind of metallic, but I figured it was just from the recent rains washing down from the hills. Doc's examination revealed bumps that were unlike anything in his considerable experience. They were warm to the touch, with an odd consistency that seemed to shift under gentle pressure. The skin covering them was stretched tight, showing a network of dark veins that hadn't been visible from a distance. Most disturbing was the way they seemed to pulse slightly, as if something inside was moving. "These are quite unusual, Eli," Doc said, maintaining the calm professional tone that had served him well through decades of difficult diagnoses. "I'd like to try a few treatments, see if we can reduce the inflammation and get you some relief from the pain. But even as he spoke, Doc's mind was racing back 20 years to another examination room. Another patient with similar symptoms. Sarah had developed bumps along her neck and shoulders. Painful swellings that had baffled him then, just as these baffled him now. The memory brought back the helplessness he'd felt, the growing desperation as conventional treatments failed to provide relief. "Doc?" Eli's voice brought him back to the present. "You look like you've seen a ghost. These things aren't going to kill me, are they?" Doc forced a reassuring smile, though his heart was beating faster than it had in years. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I want to try some poultices and see if we can draw out whatever's causing the inflammation. You're a tough man, Eli Granger. We'll figure this out together." As he prepared the treatments, Doc's eyes kept drifting to his leather medical journal, sitting on the desk like a silent witness to all the mysteries and tragedies he'd encountered over the years. Somewhere in those pages were notes about Sarah's illness, about the other 11 victims who died that terrible summer 20 years ago. Notes he'd avoided reading since then, unable to face the painful reminder of his failure to save the people who'd counted on him. But now, looking at Eli's condition and thinking about that sealed well, Doc began to wonder if those old notes might hold answers he'd been too grief-stricken to see before. Perhaps it was time to confront the past, to finally understand what had really happened to Sarah and the others. The truth might be more terrible than he'd ever imagined. But ignorance had cost too many lives already. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the clinic windows as Doc finished applying the first round of treatments to Eli's condition. The cowboy bore the discomfort stoically, trusting in Doc's expertise, despite the obvious concern in the physician's eyes. "I want you to stay in town for a few days," Doc said, helping Eli down from the examination table. "Get yourself a room at Morrison's boarding house and come see me twice daily. We need to keep a close watch on how these respond to treatment." Eli nodded, though Doc could see questions forming in the cowboy's honest eyes. Men like Eli Granger didn't panic easily, but they weren't fools either. He could sense that Doc was more worried than he was letting on, and that knowledge would weigh on him until answers came. As Eli left the clinic, Doc stood at the window watching the familiar figure walk slowly down the street toward the boarding house. The cowboy's normally confident stride was reduced to a careful shuffle, and he kept one hand pressed protectively against his neck. It was a sight that brought back too many painful memories, too many questions that had haunted Doc's sleep for 2 decades. The leather medical journal seemed to call to him from its place on the desk. Inside those pages lay the record of his life's work, including the detailed notes he'd taken during that terrible summer when Sarah and 11 others had died from a mysterious illness that defied every treatment he'd attempted. He'd written everything down with scientific precision, documenting symptoms and treatments with the desperate hope that future understanding might emerge from present failure. Now, 20 years later, those notes might finally serve their intended purpose. But opening that journal would mean confronting memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. Facing again the helplessness and grief that had nearly broken him after Sarah's death. It would mean admitting that the sealed well and its terrible secret might not be as safely contained as the town council had promised. Doc's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the journal, then stopped. Not yet. First, he needed to try everything he could for Eli using conventional medicine. Only when those efforts failed, and in his heart, he suspected they would he open those old wounds and face the truth about what had really happened. In Fairwater 20 years ago, outside, the town was settling into its evening rhythm, unaware that something from its dark past might be stirring once again. The sealed well sat silent in its distant valley, its concrete cap weathered by 2 decades of rain and snow, its terrible secrets locked away beneath layers of stone and earth. But seals could crack, concrete could crumble, and some things that were buried had a way of fighting their way back to the surface. Doc. Avery closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to his late wife, asking for strength for whatever lay ahead. He had the feeling that Fairwater's long period of peace was about to end, and that he would once again be called upon to face mysteries that challenged everything he thought he knew about medicine, about life, and about the thin line between the natural and supernatural worlds. The next morning brought no improvement to Eli's condition. If anything, the bumps had grown larger overnight, stretching the skin to an alarming degree. Doc had seen infections worsen before, but never quite like this, never with the strange pulsing movement that seemed to come from within the swellings themselves. "They're getting more tender," Eli reported as he settled onto the examination table, his face pale with exhaustion. "Kept me awake most of the night. Feels like something's moving around in there, Doc. I know that sounds crazy, but nothing sounds crazy to me anymore," Doc replied, preparing fresh poultices with hands that had grown steadier with purpose. "I've seen enough mysteries in 40 years of practice to know that medicine doesn't have all the answers." As Doc worked, applying warm compresses to the largest of the bumps, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The swelling wasn't just larger, it had changed color, taking on a sickly greenish hue that reminded him uncomfortably of pond scum. Worse still, there appeared to be movement just beneath the surface, subtle shifts and ripples that had nothing to do with Eli's pulse or breathing. "This one here feels ready to burst," Doc said, gently probing the largest bump with a sterile probe. "I think we need to." The words died in his throat as the swelling suddenly ruptured under minimal pressure, releasing not the pus and blood he'd expected, but something far more disturbing. A dark, viscous fluid poured from the opening, and within that fluid something moved. Something alive. Doc stumbled backward, his medical training warring with disbelief as tiny, worm-like creatures writhed in the discharge. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen in any medical text, translucent, segmented beings about the length of his little finger, moving with purposeful intelligence rather than the random squirming of ordinary parasites. "What in God's name?" Eli began, then fell silent as he caught sight of what had emerged from his own body. The creatures seemed drawn to moisture, immediately beginning to move toward the edges of the examination table where Doc kept a basin of water. Their movement was coordinated, almost deliberate, as if they possessed some form of collective intelligence that guided their actions. Doc's hand shook as he reached for a glass specimen jar, his scientific curiosity overcoming his revulsion. Whatever these things were, they represented something entirely outside his medical experience. But even as he began to collect samples, his mind was racing backward through time to another examination room, another patient, another impossible discovery that had shattered his understanding of the natural world. "Sarah," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer. 20 years ago, he'd watched similar creatures emerge from his wife's body in the final stages of her illness. He'd dismissed the memory as a product of grief and exhaustion, convinced that his overwrought mind had imagined the impossible details. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence before him, he realized that his memories had been accurate all along. "Doc, what are those things?" Eli's voice was steady despite the horror of his situation, showing the same courage that had made him a successful trail boss. "Are they what's been making me sick?" Doc forced himself to focus on his patient rather than the painful memories, threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know what they are, Eli, but I'm going to find out. For now, let's get this cleaned up and bandaged. We need to prevent any more of them from another bump burst without warning, releasing more of the dark fluid and its writhing inhabitants." Then another. Within minutes, 3 of the largest swellings had ruptured spontaneously, as if the emergence of the first group had triggered some kind of coordinated response from the others. Eli gritted his teeth against the pain, but remained remarkably composed as Doc worked to clean and bandage the wounds. "This happened before, didn't it?" he asked. "That's why you look like you've seen this nightmare already." Doc's hands never stopped moving as he tended to Eli's injuries, but his voice carried the weight of 20 years of suppressed grief. "My wife, Sarah, she developed similar symptoms before she died. I thought I'd imagined what I saw when she passed, convinced myself it was impossible. But it was real, wasn't it? All of it." "How many others?" Eli asked quietly. 11 more after Sarah. All died within a week of the first symptoms appearing." Doc finished the last bandage and stepped back, his face grim with understanding. They'd all been to the same area before they got sick, the valley with the old well. Eli's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "The waterhole where I stopped, where the cattle wouldn't drink. The town council sealed that well 20 years ago after the outbreak ended. They said it was contaminated, dangerous. But they never explained what they found down there. Never. Told us exactly what killed our loved ones." Doc's voice grew harder as old anger resurfaced. "They buried the truth along with the bodies, and now it's happening again." The creatures in the specimen jar had gone still, clustering together in the bottom of the container as if seeking comfort from one another. Under closer examination, they appeared even more alien. Their translucent bodies revealed internal structures that bore no resemblance to any earthly organism Doc had studied. "We need to get you isolated," Doc said, the physician in him taking control despite the emotional turmoil. "If this spreads the way it did before, Doc," Eli's voice was calm but urgent, "look at the jar." Doc turned to see that the creatures had begun to emit a faint phosphorescent glow. The light pulsed in a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat made visible. More disturbing still, similar glows were beginning to appear beneath Eli's bandages, suggesting that more of the organisms remained in his system. "They're communicating," Doc realized with growing horror. "The ones that emerged are signaling to the ones still inside you." As if responding to his words, Eli suddenly doubled over as another wave of pain swept through him. When he straightened, his face had taken on the same sickly pallor that Doc remembered from Sarah's final days. "How long do I have?" Eli asked with the straightforward acceptance of a man who'd faced death many times on dangerous cattle drives. Doc wanted to lie, to offer false hope as he'd done with Sarah and the others. But Eli deserved honesty, and perhaps honesty was the only weapon they had against whatever malevolent force they were facing. "If this follows the same pattern as before, the organisms will continue to emerge over the next few days." The processes Doc's voice caught as memories of Sarah's suffering threatened to overwhelm him. "It's not an easy death, Eli. The creatures seem to consume their host from within before emerging to find new victims." Eli nodded grimly. "Then we'd better figure out how to stop them before I become a danger to others." Doc looked at his patient with newfound respect. Even facing a horrific and mysterious death, Eli's first concern was for the safety of his community. It was exactly the kind of selfless courage that made frontier towns like Fairwater possible, and it reminded Doc why he devoted his life to serving such people. "I have Sarah's medical records," Doc said, making a decision that had been 20 years in the making. "I documented everything during the outbreak, hoping someday it might help future victims. I never had the courage to look at those notes again after she died. But now you don't have a choice," Eli finished. "Neither of us do." Doc nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. He'd failed Sarah and 11 other patients 20 years ago, but perhaps their sacrifice could provide the knowledge needed to save Eli and prevent another outbreak. The creatures in the jar had gone dark again, settling into an ominous stillness that suggested they were waiting for something. Outside, the normal sounds of Fairwater's daily life continued: children playing, merchants conducting business, neighbors sharing gossip over garden fences. The town had no idea that an ancient horror had returned to threaten everything they held dear. But Doc Avery knew. And this time, he was determined to face the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. Sarah's death would not be in vain if he could use what he'd learned to save others. The leather medical journal waited on his desk like a key to unlock mysteries that had haunted him for 2 decades. The real battle for Fairwater's soul was about to begin. That evening, Doc sat alone in his clinic as shadows lengthened across the floorboards. The leather medical journal opened before him for the first time in 20 years. The familiar weight of the book in his hands brought back memories so vivid. He could almost smell Sarah's lavender perfume, almost hear her gentle voice reading to him from her favorite novels on quiet Sunday afternoons. The pages fell open naturally to the section he'd avoided for 2 decades, detailed notes from the summer of 1854, when Fairwater had faced its darkest hour. His younger self's handwriting filled page after page with clinical observations, desperate theories, and increasingly frantic attempts to understand what was killing his patients. June 15th, 1854. Sarah Avery, age 32, presents with unusual swellings along the neck and shoulders. Patient reports recent visit to Wildflower Meadow near the old well site. Symptoms unlike any textbook description. Applied standard poultices with minimal effect. Doc's finger traced the faded ink, remembering how hopeful he'd been in those early days. Standard treatments would work, he'd assured himself. Medical science would prevail over whatever strange malady had afflicted his beloved wife. June 18th, 1854. Patient's condition worsening. Swellings have doubled in size and taken on greenish discoloration. Patient reports sensation of movement within the affected areas. Applied leeches to reduce inflammation. No improvement observed. Page after page documented the same heartbreaking pattern. Each entry revealed his growing desperation as conventional treatments failed. His careful medical language gradually giving way to barely controlled panic as he watched the woman he loved slip away from him. June 22nd, 1854. Thomas Henderson, age 45, presents with identical symptoms. Reports drinking from stream near the old well site 3 days prior. This marks the 4th case in 1 week. Beginning to suspect common environmental factor. Doc's breath caught as he read his own words from decades past. Even then, his younger self had suspected the well, but he'd been too focused on treating individual patients to investigate the source of the contamination. If only he'd acted on those suspicions sooner, perhaps Sarah and the others might have lived. The most difficult pages came near the end of the outbreak, when his clinical objectivity had crumbled entirely in the face of inexplicable horrors. His handwriting became increasingly erratic as he documented phenomena that challenged everything he'd learned in medical school. June 28th, 1854. Sarah passed at 3:17 a.m. Final moments marked by emergence of unknown organisms from ruptures in affected tissue. Specimens appear to be parasitic in nature, but exhibit coordinated behavior suggesting intelligence. Have preserved samples in alcohol solution for future study. Doc's hands trembled as he turned to the back of the journal, where he'd tucked away the original well-sealing testimony that Martha Henderson had mentioned. The yellowed papers were brittle with age, but the words remained clear enough to read. The testimony had been sworn by 5 men who descended into the well after the outbreak ended, tasked with discovering what had caused the mysterious illness. Their accounts made for disturbing reading, describing discoveries that defied rational explanation. We found the water at the bottom was thick as syrup and glowed with an unnatural light. Read the statement of Jonas Mitchell, Sarah's cousin. The stuff moved on its own, forming patterns that hurt your eyes to look at. And the smell, Lord preserve us. The smell was like nothing on this earth. The creatures were everywhere, testified Samuel Morrison, grandfather of the current boarding house owner. covering the well walls like living moss, pulsing and writhing in rhythm with each other. They seemed to know we were there, turning toward our lantern light with what looked like curiosity. When we tried to take samples, they attacked, reported. Henry Coleman, the current mayor's father. Not like animals defending themselves, but with coordination, like soldiers following orders. We barely escaped with our lives. The final testimony came from Dr. Hutchinson, Doc's predecessor, who had supervised the well sealing operation. His account was the most disturbing of all. The organisms appear to be of great antiquity, possibly predating human habitation of this region. Local Native American legends speak of cursed waters that steal souls, suggesting previous encounters with these entities. The well seems to provide them with an optimal breeding environment, dark, moist, and connected to underground water sources throughout the territory. I have concluded that these beings are not natural parasites in any conventional sense. They demonstrate intelligence, adaptability, and most troubling of all, the ability to use human hosts for reproduction. The creatures emerge only after consuming the host life force, then seek new victims to continue the cycle. My recommendation is immediate and permanent sealing of the well, followed by quarantine of the entire valley. Under no circumstances should the seal be disturbed, as even a small breach could result in widespread contamination of regional water. Supplies. Doc set the testimony aside and reached for the final piece of evidence from those dark days, a glass vial containing the preserved specimens he'd collected from Sarah's body. The alcohol had turned brown with age, but the creatures remained visible, their translucent forms unchanged by 20 years of chemical preservation. As he held the vial up to the lamplight, Doc noticed something that made his heart race. The preserved specimens were glowing with the same faint phosphorescence he'd observed in the fresh samples from Eli. After 2 decades in alcohol solution, they were still somehow alive, still somehow aware. A knock at the clinic door interrupted his disturbing observations. Doc quickly closed the journal and tucked the testimony back into its hiding place, then went to answer the summons. He found Martha Henderson on his doorstep, her ancient face creased with worry. "Doc, I need to speak with you about Eli Granger," she said, glancing around nervously before entering the clinic. "I heard he's taken ill with something strange." Martha was 87 years old, one of the original settlers who'd helped establish Fairwater in its early days. She'd been 37 during the 1854 outbreak, young enough to remember every detail, but old enough to understand the implications of what she'd witnessed. "Word travels fast in a small town," Doc replied, gesturing for her to take a seat. "What can you tell me about the old days, Martha? About what really happened at that well?" The elderly woman's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking back across decades of carefully buried memories. "I was one of the ones who voted to seal it," she said quietly. "We all knew it wasn't natural, what was down there. But we were so desperate to put it behind us, to forget what we'd lost. Sarah was your friend," Doc said gently. "You must have wondered what really killed her." Martha's weathered hands twisted in her lap. "I knew what killed her, Doc. We all did. But talking about it wouldn't bring her back. And we were afraid that acknowledging the truth might somehow make it happen again." "It is happening again," Doc told her. "Eli has the same symptoms, the same." He paused, struggling to find words for phenomena that defied description. "The same impossible things are emerging from his body that I saw emerge from Sarah's." Martha closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Then God help us all, because that means the seal has failed. And if those creatures are loose again—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Doc understood the implication. If the well seal had been breached, if the creatures had access to the underground water system that connected to streams and springs throughout the territory, then Fairwater wasn't facing an isolated outbreak. They were facing the beginning of something that could spread far beyond their small town. carrying death and horror to communities that had no knowledge of the ancient evil that had been awakened. The sealed well held secrets that went back generations, and those secrets were about to claim new victims unless Doc could find a way to stop them. The battle for Fairwater's survival had begun, and this time, Doc was determined not to fail. The next morning brought disturbing news from multiple sources. Doc had barely finished his breakfast when Mayor Coleman arrived at the clinic, his face grim with the kind of worry that came from carrying secrets too heavy for one man to bear. "Alone. We need to talk," Coleman said without preamble, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Privately, Doc led him into the clinic's back room, where they could speak without fear of interruption. Coleman was a good man in his 60s, elected to his position because of his level head and fair dealing. But he'd inherited more than just administrative duties from his father. He'd also inherited knowledge of Fairwater's darkest secrets. "Martha Henderson came to see me after she left here last night," Coleman began, settling into a chair with the careful movements of a man carrying a great burden. "She told me about Eli's condition, about what you found. Then you know what we're dealing with," Doc replied, studying the mayor's face for signs of the denial he'd expected. Instead, he saw only weary acceptance. "My father was one of the men who sealed that well," Coleman said quietly. "He made me promise never to speak of what they found down there, but he also made me promise to watch for signs that the seal might be failing. I've been checking on it regularly for 20 years, Doc. Last month, I found cracks in the concrete." Doc felt his heart sink. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was hoping the damage wasn't serious, that maybe the cracks were just from weather and settling. I had a crew repair them quietly, told them it was just routine maintenance." Coleman's hands clenched into fists. "I should have known better. Should have remembered that my father always said those things down there were patient, waiting for any chance to escape." "We need to see the well," Doc said, though the prospect filled him with dread. "If Eli drank contaminated water from that stream, then we need to know how far the contamination has spread." Coleman nodded reluctantly. "I can take you there this afternoon. But Doc, there's something else you need to know. Eli isn't the only one showing symptoms." The words hit Doc like a physical blow. "Who else?" "Young Tom Brady came to see me yesterday evening, complaining of bumps along his shoulder blade. Said he'd stopped to water his horse at that same stream on his way back from visiting his sister in Cedar Falls." Coleman's voice grew heavy with implications. "And Mrs. Garrett mentioned that her husband has been feeling poorly since he returned from checking their cattle pasture near the valley." Doc closed his eyes, seeing the familiar pattern beginning to repeat itself. First one victim, then several, then a spreading wave of infection that would sweep through the community like wildfire, unless they could stop it at the source this time. "We need to warn people to avoid the valley," Doc said. "And we need to prepare for more cases. How do we warn them without causing panic?" Coleman asked. "If we tell people the truth about those creatures, we tell them there's contaminated water in the area," Doc interrupted. "It's not a lie. We post warnings about staying away from streams and water sources in that region until we can determine the extent of the contamination." They spent the next hour planning their response, drawing up notices to be posted throughout town and making lists of people who might have been exposed. It was exhausting work made more difficult by the need for secrecy. They couldn't reveal the true nature of the threat without risking mass panic. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to make the journey to the sealed well. Doc packed his medical bag with supplies he hoped he wouldn't need, while Coleman gathered tools that might be useful for inspecting the seal's integrity. Both men understood they were about to confront something that challenged their understanding of the natural world. The ride to the valley took them through familiar countryside that had taken on an ominous quality in light of recent events. Rolling hills covered with prairie grass stretched to the horizon. broken by stands of cottonwood trees that marked the locations of streams and water sources. It was beautiful country, the kind that had drawn settlers like Doc and Sarah to build lives in this remote corner of the territory. But now, Doc found himself wondering how many of those water sources might be contaminated, how far the underground network of caves and streams might carry the ancient infection. The creatures they were dealing with had survived for untold centuries, waiting patiently for their chance to emerge and claim new victims. The valley itself looked deceptively peaceful. When they arrived, cottonwood trees provided welcome shade, and the sound of running water created an almost idyllic atmosphere. If not for the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface, it would have been easy to understand why Sarah had chosen this spot for her wildflower gathering expeditions. The sealed well sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall grass that had grown up around its concrete cap over the years. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than an old foundation or abandoned piece of infrastructure. But as they drew closer, Doc could see the cracks Coleman had mentioned, dark lines that ran across the surface like scars. "The damage is worse than it was last month," Coleman observed, dismounting and walking around the seal's perimeter. "These new cracks are deeper, and look here." He pointed to a section where water had seeped through, creating a dark stain on the concrete. Surface. Doc knelt beside the largest crack and caught a whiff of the same metallic smell that Eli had described. The odor was faint but unmistakable, carrying with it suggestions of deep earth and ancient decay that made his stomach turn. "The stream that Eli drank from starts about 50 yards upstream," Coleman said, pointing toward a line of trees that marked the water's path. "If contamination is seeping through these cracks, then it's been flowing downstream for who knows how long," Doc finished grimly. "We need to trace the water flow, see how far this contamination might have spread." They spent the next hour following the stream's path, noting how it wound through the valley before joining larger waterways that served ranches and settlements throughout the region. It was a sobering exercise that revealed just how many people might be at risk if the contamination continued to spread. "Look at this," Coleman called out from a bend in the stream about a quarter-mile from the well. He was standing beside a natural pool where the water had gathered, staring down at something that had caught his attention. Doc joined him and immediately saw what had alarmed the mayor. The water in the pool had an oily sheen to it, and beneath the surface, faint traces of the same phosphorescent glow they'd observed in the creatures from Eli's body. Worse still, there were signs of movement in the depth, subtle currents that had nothing to do with the stream's natural flow. "They're in the water," Doc said, his voice barely above a whisper, "not just contaminating it, but actually living in it." Coleman picked up a long stick and poked at the water's surface. Immediately, the pool erupted with activity as dozens of the translucent creatures rose from the depths, their forms clearly visible in the afternoon sunlight. They moved with purpose, investigating the disturbance and seeming to evaluate whether it represented a threat or an opportunity. "How many do you think are down there?" Coleman asked, pulling his stick back as the creatures began to cluster around where it had touched the water. "Hundreds," Doc replied, watching the coordinated way the organisms moved. "Maybe thousands. And if they're this active here, imagine what must be happening at the source." They returned to the sealed well with heavy hearts, both understanding that they were facing a crisis far worse than either had imagined. The seal hadn't just failed. It had been slowly deteriorating for months, possibly years, allowing the ancient contamination to seep into the regional water system. "We need help," Coleman said as they prepared to return to town. "This is beyond what we can handle alone." Doc nodded, but he knew that outside help would come with questions they couldn't answer honestly. How could they explain creatures that defied scientific classification? How could they describe an ancient evil that had been sealed away by previous generations? "First, we need to prepare for more cases," Doc said. If people have been drinking contaminated water from streams throughout the region, we're going to see an outbreak that makes the one 20 years ago look small by comparison. The ride back to Fairwater was conducted in grim silence, both men lost in thoughts too dark to share. The familiar landscape now seemed threatening, every stream and water source a potential carrier of ancient horror. The town they'd sworn to protect was facing a threat that challenged not just their medical knowledge, but their understanding of the natural world itself. As they reached the outskirts of town, Doc caught sight of a familiar figure walking slowly down the main street. Even from a distance, he could see that Tom Brady was favoring his left shoulder, moving with the careful gait of someone trying to minimize pain. Another victim, just as Coleman had warned. The outbreak was beginning in earnest, and this time, Doc was determined to be ready for it. The secrets buried in his medical journal and the testimony of the well-sealing witnesses would have to be enough to guide them through the darkness ahead. Sarah's death had taught him the cost of ignorance. Now he would have to discover whether knowledge was enough to save the people who depended on him. The ancient evil was stirring, but Fairwater wouldn't face it unprepared. Not this time. Dr. Hutchinson's final letter lay spread across Doc Avery's desk like a map to a territory no living person wanted to explore. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible, filled with the desperate observations of a man who had faced the impossible and found his medical training woefully inadequate. My dear colleague, the letter began, I write this in the hope that someday, someone with greater wisdom than I possess will find a way to combat the horror that has visited our community. What I am about to describe will challenge your understanding of medicine, of nature, and perhaps of reality itself. Doc had discovered the letter tucked inside the back cover of his medical journal, placed there by Dr. Hutchinson before his death shortly after the well-sealing operation. Reading it now, with 3 more victims showing symptoms throughout Fairwater, felt like receiving guidance from beyond the grave. The organisms appear to be of ancient origin, possibly predating human civilization in this region. They demonstrate intelligence far beyond that of simple parasites, coordinating their actions in ways that suggest sophisticated communication between individuals. Most disturbing of all, they seem to learn from each encounter, adapting their behavior to overcome whatever resistance they encounter. Tom Brady had arrived at the clinic that morning, his condition already advanced beyond what Eli had shown initially. The bumps along his shoulder blade had grown to the size of chicken eggs, and the skin around them had taken on the same sickly phosphorescent quality that Doc remembered from Sarah's final days. How long have you been feeling poorly, Tom? Doc asked as he prepared his examination instruments. Started 3 days ago, Tom replied, his young face pale with pain and confusion. Just a little soreness at first. Figured I'd pulled something lifting hay bales. But they've been growing fast, Doc, and they feel... He paused, struggling to find words for an impossible sensation. They feel like they're alive in there. Doc's examination confirmed his worst fears. The organisms in Tom's body were more active than those he'd observed in Eli, moving visibly beneath the skin and responding to external pressure with what appeared to be defensive behavior. When he applied gentle pressure to one of the bumps, he could actually see the creatures inside repositioning themselves, as if they were aware of his presence and preparing to resist his intervention. I have attempted every treatment known to medical science, Dr. Hutchinson's letter continued, from standard antiparasitic medications to experimental compounds of my own devising. The creatures adapt to each approach with remarkable speed, developing resistance to treatments that initially showed promise. It is as if they possess some form of collective memory that allows them to share information about threats and countermeasures. The door chime announced another arrival, and Doc looked up to see Mrs. Garrett supporting her husband as he shuffled into the clinic. Robert Garrett was a robust man in his 50s, but today he moved like someone decades older, his face drawn with exhaustion and his breathing labored. "Doc, I'm sorry to bother you when you're busy," Mrs. Garrett said, her voice tight with worry. "But Robert's been getting worse since yesterday, and I didn't know where else to turn." Doc helped Robert onto a second examination table, noting immediately that his condition was even more advanced than Tom's. Bumps covered not just his neck and shoulders, but had spread down his arms and across his chest. Some had already begun to show the telltale signs of impending rupture-stretched skin that had grown translucent enough to reveal the writhing forms within. "When did you last visit your cattle pasture near the valley?" Doc asked, though he already suspected the answer. 5 days ago," Robert gasped. "Stopped to drink from that little stream that runs down from the hills. Water tasted strange, but I was thirsty from the ride." Doc exchanged glances with Mrs. Garrett, seeing in her eyes the same fear that he'd watched grow in Sarah's expression 20 years ago. The fear of losing someone you love to something beyond comprehension, beyond the reach of medicine or prayer. The most troubling aspect of these organisms, Dr. Hutchinson's letter revealed, is their apparent intelligence. They do not simply consume their hosts, they seem to study them, learning about human physiology and behavior in ways that suggest they are preparing for something larger than individual parasitism. I have observed them manipulating their hosts' behavior in subtle ways, compelling them to seek out water sources where other organisms might be present. As if responding to his thoughts, both Tom and Robert suddenly turned their heads toward the window that faced the direction of the valley. Their movements were synchronized, unconscious, as if they were responding to some signal that Doc couldn't perceive. "Do you gentlemen feel drawn to return to the valley?" Doc asked carefully, watching their reactions. Tom blinked in surprise. "Now that you mention it, yes. I've been having dreams about going back to that stream, about needing to drink from it again. Thought it was just because I was thirsty from being sick." Robert nodded weakly. "Same here. Keep thinking about how cool and refreshing the water was, even though it tasted wrong. It's like something's calling me back there." Doc felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications. The organisms weren't just parasites. They were turning their hosts into vectors for spreading the infection, compelling them to return to contaminated water sources where they can infect others or complete some unknown phase of their life cycle. "I fear that what we have witnessed is merely the beginning," Dr. Hutchinson's letter concluded. "These creatures appear to be following some ancient pattern, some biological imperative that extends far beyond simple survival. They are preparing for something, and I suspect that the death of individual hosts is merely one step in a larger process that we do not yet understand. If you are reading this letter, then my fears have been realized and the creatures have returned. Learn from my failures. Do not attempt to treat them as ordinary parasites. They are something far older and more dangerous, something that views humanity not as masters of this world, but as a resource to be exploited in service of their own incomprehensible goals. May God have mercy on us all." Doc set the letter aside and looked at his two patients, both showing signs of the same compulsion that Dr. Hutchinson had described. They were no longer just sick men seeking medical help. They were becoming something else, transformed by organisms that had survived longer than human civilization and possessed intelligence that operated according to rules no earthly creature followed. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the clinic windows, casting long shadows across the examination room. Outside, the sounds of normal life continued: children playing, merchants conducting business, neighbors greeting each other on the street. Fairwater carried on with its daily routines, unaware that an ancient evil was stirring in its midst, transforming its citizens into servants of something that predated human understanding. Doc Avery closed his eyes and said a prayer for strength, knowing that the real battle was only beginning. The creatures were learning, adapting, preparing for whatever came next in their incomprehensible plan. And somewhere in the sealed well, Their ancient source continued to pulse with malevolent life, waiting for the moment when its children would return to complete their mysterious purpose. The specimen jar sat in Doc's private office like a window into hell itself. He'd retrieved it from its hiding place after examining his latest patients, driven by a desperate need to understand what they were truly facing. The preserved organisms from Sarah's body floated in their alcohol solution, unchanged by 20 years of chemical suspension, and somehow, impossibly, still alive. As Doc watched in fascination and horror, the creatures began to glow with that familiar phosphorescent light. But this time, the glow wasn't random. It pulsed in a specific pattern, a rhythm that seemed almost like a form of communication. More disturbing still, similar glows were beginning to emanate from the direction of the clinic's main room, where Tom and Robert lay on their examination tables. "They're talking to each other," Doc whispered to himself, the implications making his hands tremble. Across 20 years, through glass and alcohol, they're still connected. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his observations. "Come in," he called, quickly covering the specimen jar with a cloth. Mayor Coleman entered, his face grim with new worries. "Doc, we have a problem. 3 more people came to see me this afternoon, all complaining of symptoms similar to what you've described. And there's something else. People are starting to notice that the sick ones are all drawn to leave town, heading in the direction of the valley." Doc nodded grimly. Dr. Hutchinson wrote about this. The organisms seem to compel their hosts to return to water sources where they can spread the infection or complete their life cycle. We need to establish a quarantine, not just for the safety of the uninfected, but to prevent the victims from being used as vectors. How do we explain quarantining people for what looks like a simple skin condition? Coleman asked. The town council is already asking questions about the water warnings we posted. Before Doc could answer, a commotion erupted from the main clinic room. They rushed to investigate and found Tom Brady sitting up on his examination table, staring intently at the window that faced toward the valley. His eyes had taken on a glassy quality, and when Doc spoke his name, Tom didn't respond. "Tom, can you hear me?" Doc asked, moving closer. Tom's head turned slowly toward him, but his expression remained distant, almost dreamy. "The water calls," he said in a voice that sounded only partially his own. "It sings to us, Doc, such beautiful songs from the deep places." Robert Garrett was experiencing a similar episode on the adjacent table. "We should go to them," he murmured, his voice carrying the same strange quality. "They're waiting for us." They've been waiting so long. Doc had seen enough. "Mayor, we need to set up a proper quarantine facility immediately. And we need restraints. The patients aren't entirely in control of their actions anymore." As if responding to his words, both men suddenly became agitated, struggling to rise from their tables despite their obvious physical weakness. Their movements were coordinated, purposeful, driven by some compulsion that overrode their conscious will. "Where do you want to go?" Doc asked, though he already knew the answer. "Home," Tom said, though his eyes remained focused on the distant valley. "We need to go home to the deep water, where the ancient mothers are singing." The phrase ancient mothers sent a chill through Doc's bones. He'd never heard either man use such language before, and the words carried implications he didn't want to contemplate. Working together, Doc and Coleman managed to secure the patients with soft restraints that would keep them safe while allowing some freedom of movement. It was clear that both men were fighting an internal battle between their human consciousness and something else that was gaining influence over their actions. "What did Dr. Hutchinson's research say about this stage?" Coleman asked quietly, stepping away from the patients so they wouldn't overhear. "That it gets worse," Doc replied grimly. "The organisms don't just consume their hosts physically, they gradually take over their mental functions as well. In the final stages, the victims become completely controlled by the creature's collective intelligence. How long do we have? Doc consulted his notes from the 1854 outbreak. Based on the previous cases, maybe 2 days before they reached that final stage. After that, he paused, remembering the horror of watching Sarah in her last moments. After that, they're no longer human in any meaningful sense. The afternoon passed in a blur of grim preparation. More patients arrived with early symptoms, forcing Doc to establish a makeshift quarantine facility in the town's unused schoolhouse. By evening, he was treating 7 victims, with reports of several more showing initial signs of infection. The pattern was becoming clear. Everyone who consumed water from streams connected to the valley was at risk, and the contamination was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Worse, the creatures seemed to be learning from each new host, adapting their behavior and accelerating their timeline. As night fell, Doc found himself alone in the quarantine facility, listening to the disturbing sounds coming from his patients. They were talking to each other in low whispers, using words and phrases that belonged to no human language he'd ever heard. When he tried to approach close enough to understand what they were saying, they would fall silent, watching him with eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. It was then that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The preserved specimens in his specimen jar, still glowing faintly in his office back at the clinic, were pulsing in perfect synchronization with the phosphorescent glow emanating from the quarantine patients. Whatever intelligence guided these creatures, it operated across time and distance in ways that defied every scientific principle he understood. "Dr. Avery?" A voice called from behind him. He turned to see Eli Granger standing in the schoolhouse doorway. But something was wrong with the cowboy's appearance. His skin had taken on a waxy quality, and his eyes held the same distant expression Doc had observed in the other patients. "Eli, you should be resting," Doc said carefully, noting that the restraints he'd applied earlier had been somehow removed. "The mothers are calling," Eli said in that same dreamy voice. "They want us to come home now, all of us together, so the great work can begin." Behind him, Doc could hear the other patients stirring, their whispered conversations growing more urgent. Whatever phase the creatures were entering, it was accelerating rapidly. The careful timeline he'd observed 20 years ago was being compressed, as if the organisms had learned from their previous emergence and were preparing to implement their plans more efficiently. Doc realized with growing horror that he was witnessing not just a medical crisis, but the beginning of something far larger and more terrible. The creatures weren't just parasites seeking new hosts, they were preparing for some kind of coordinated action that required multiple infected individuals working in concert. The ancient evil that Fairwater had tried so desperately to seal away was finally ready to reveal its true purpose, and Doc feared that humanity was about to discover just how small and helpless they really were in the face of intelligence that had been planning and preparing for longer than civilization itself had existed. The revelation came at dawn, hidden in the most unlikely place imaginable. Doc had spent a sleepless night watching over his quarantine patients, who had grown increasingly agitated as the hours passed. Their whispered conversations in that alien tongue had grown more urgent, more coordinated, until they were speaking in perfect unison, 7 different voices forming a single, incomprehensible chant. It was while searching for additional medical supplies in the clinic's basement storage area that Doc discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Fairwater's history. Behind a stack of old pharmaceutical crates, he found a metal box that bore the official seal of the Territorial Survey Office. Inside were documents that revealed the truth about the well's original purpose, a truth that had been deliberately hidden from the town's residents for generations. The original well survey map, spread across his desk like a blueprint for disaster. Far from being a simple water source, the well had been deliberately constructed over what the Geological survey described as an extensive cave system of unknown depth and origin. The surveyor's notes, written in the careful script of government bureaucrats, told a story that made Doc's hand shake as he read survey conducted at the request of the War Department. The first document began to investigate reports of unusual phenomena observed by advance scouts in the region. Local Native American tribes have consistently avoided this area, describing it as cursed ground where ancient spirits steal souls from the living. Doc's eyes widened as he read further. The well hadn't been built to provide water for settlers. It had been built as a containment system for something the government surveyors had found in the cave system below, something they'd hoped to study and control, but had ultimately decided was too dangerous to leave unsealed. Initial descent into the cave system revealed evidence of extensive biological activity, continued the survey report. Specimens collected show characteristics unlike any known terrestrial life forms. Dr. Harrison Wells, chief biologist for the survey team, has recommended immediate sealing of the cave entrance and prohibition of settlement within a 5-mile radius. However, political pressure from territorial authorities has overruled scientific recommendations. The area's strategic location and agricultural potential are considered too valuable to abandon based on what some officials dismiss as scientific superstition. A compromise solution has been reached to construct a well over the primary cave entrance, ostensibly for future settlers' use, but actually serving as a monitoring station and emergency seal. Doc turned to the next document, his horror growing as he realized the full scope of what had been hidden from Fairwater's founders. The cave system wasn't confined to the area beneath the well. It extended throughout the entire region, connecting underground water sources across hundreds of square miles. The map showed a vast network of passages and chambers, with the well site marking only the largest and most accessible entrance. Cave system appears to extend northeast toward the Colorado Territory and southwest toward New Mexico Territory. The Geological Survey noted similar phenomena have been reported at sites throughout the region, suggesting this represents a widespread biological contamination of prehistoric origin. Dr. Wells has expressed particular concern about the organisms' apparent intelligence and coordinated behavior. Laboratory observations suggest they possess some form of collective consciousness that enables rapid communication across vast distances. This characteristic makes them potentially suitable for military applications, should safe handling procedures be developed. The final document was the most disturbing of all, a classified memorandum from the War Department's Special Research Division, dated just 6 months before Fairwater's official founding. Project Underground has been discontinued following the deaths of 3 research personnel. The memorandum stated, Dr. Wells' attempts to develop military applications for the organisms have resulted in what he describes as catastrophic loss of containment. The research facility has been evacuated and sealed, with the area designated for immediate civilian settlement as cover for ongoing monitoring operations. Territorial governor has been informed that Fairwater will be established as planned, with residents unaware of the true purpose of the well or the nature of the threat it contains. Local doctor will be briefed on recognition of symptoms and provided with specialized medical supplies for emergency response. Regular reports will be forwarded to the War Department through designated channels. Doc's mind reeled as he realized the implications. Fairwater hadn't been founded by pioneers seeking new opportunities. It had been established as a cover story for a failed military experiment. The townspeople had been placed in harm's way, deliberately serving as unwitting sentries guarding a secret that their own government had decided was too dangerous to reveal. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In a separate folder marked Medical Protocols, Doc found detailed instructions for treating exposure to what the documents referred to as Project Underground specimens. The protocols were signed by his predecessor, Dr. Hutchinson, who had clearly been briefed on the true nature of the threat. From the beginning, Dr. Marcus Hutchinson has been appointed as primary medical observer for Fairwater settlement. Read the appointment letter. His duties will include monitoring residents for signs of exposure, documenting any unusual medical phenomena, and maintaining regular communication with War Department personnel regarding the status of containment. In the event of major containment failure, Dr. Hutchinson is authorized to implement emergency protocols, including quarantine procedures and, if necessary, evacuation of the settlement. Under no circumstances should local residents be informed of the true nature of the threat, as public knowledge could lead to panic and compromise ongoing security operations. Doc sank into his chair as the full horror of the situation became clear. Dr. Hutchinson had known all along what they were dealing with. The careful documentation, the preserved specimens, the detailed notes about the organism's behavior, it had all been part of a government research program that treated Fairwater citizens as test subjects in an ongoing experiment. More disturbing still, Doc found evidence that the program hadn't ended with Dr. Hutchinson's death. Medical supply shipments had continued arriving at the clinic for years after the 1854 outbreak, labeled as routine pharmaceutical deliveries, but actually containing specialized equipment for monitoring and containing biological threats. Someone, somewhere, was still watching Fairwater and waiting for signs that the ancient evil was stirring again. A folder marked Current Operations contained the most recent documents, including reports filed within the past 5 years. To Doc's amazement, the reports were signed by Mayor Coleman, who had apparently inherited his father's role as an unwitting government informant. The reports described the deteriorating condition of the well seal, the increasing frequency of unusual wildlife behavior in the valley, and growing concerns about the long-term stability of the containment system. The most recent report, filed just 3 months ago, recommended immediate evaluation by government specialists. Seal integrity compromised beyond local repair capabilities. Coleman had written, recommend immediate deployment of specialized containment team before situation escalates to emergency levels. The response from Washington was brief and chilling. Current political climate prevents deployment of federal resources for this purpose. Local authorities are advised to maintain surveillance and report any significant developments. Emergency protocols remain in effect. Doc realized with growing horror that they were completely alone. The government that had created this situation had essentially abandoned Fairwater to its fate, leaving the townspeople to face an ancient evil with nothing but their own courage and determination. But perhaps most shocking of all was the final document in the folder, a medical evaluation report that made Doc's blood run cold. It was signed by his own hand, documenting routine medical examinations conducted over the past 20 years. Examinations that had included blood samples, tissue samples, and detailed health histories that had been forwarded to government researchers. Without his knowledge or consent, someone had been using his own medical practice as a collection point for ongoing research into the long-term effects of exposure to the organisms. His patients had been unwitting test subjects, and he had been an unknowing collaborator in their exploitation. The weight of betrayal and manipulation settled on Doc's shoulders like a physical burden. Sarah's death, the suffering of his patients, the fear and secrecy that had haunted Fairwater for decades, it had all been orchestrated by people who viewed human lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of knowledge and power. But now that he knew the truth, Doc was determined to use it to save his town. The government might have abandoned Fairwater, but the documents contained information about the organisms, nature, and behavior that could prove crucial in developing effective countermeasures. Sarah's death and the suffering of countless others would not be in vain. If he could turn the government's own research against the ancient evil they had failed to contain, the battle for Fairwater's survival was about to become a battle against not just supernatural horror, but human betrayal on a scale that challenged everything Doc had believed about justice and protection. The real enemy wasn't just the creatures in the well. It was the system that had put them there and then abandoned. The people it had sworn to protect. Sarah's hidden research notes lay scattered across the kitchen table of their old home, each page a testament to her courage and a dagger through Doc's heart. He had discovered them purely by accident while searching for anything that might help him understand the government's research program. Behind loose floorboards in what had been Sarah's sewing room, he found a cache of documents that revealed his late wife had been far more than an innocent victim of the 1854 outbreak. June 10th, 1854. Something is wrong with the well. Sarah's careful handwriting began. The children have been getting sick after playing near the stream, and Mrs. Henderson's cattle refused to drink from the water downstream. I've decided to investigate despite Marcus's concerns about my safety. Doc's hands trembled as he read his wife's words, realizing that she had been conducting her own investigation into the mysterious illnesses weeks before she became infected. The woman he had loved and lost had been trying to protect their community while he remained focused on treating symptoms rather than addressing the source. June 12, 1854. Visited the old Native American woman who lives east of town. She became very agitated when I mentioned the well, said it was built over a place her people call the Deep Singers. She described creatures that steal spirits and use human bodies to birth their young. I thought it was superstition until she showed me markings on ancient stones near the site. Page after page revealed Sarah's growing understanding of what they were truly facing. She had interviewed tribal elders, studied geological formations, and even ventured into the restricted government archives in the territorial capital. Her investigation had uncovered evidence of similar incidents throughout the Western Territories, all connected to underground cave systems that harbored the ancient organisms. June 18, 1854. The government knows. Found records of military expeditions sent to investigate biological anomalies at sites throughout Colorado and New Mexico territories. Dr. Wells has been conducting experiments, trying to weaponize the organisms for military use. The well at Fairwater was built as part of their research program. Doc's vision blurred as he read his wife's final entries, documenting her desperate attempts to find a way to destroy the organisms before they could spread throughout the territory. She had discovered references to ancient Native American techniques for combating the creatures, methods that involved specific mineral compounds found in certain rock formations. June 20th, 1854. The tribal medicine woman shared the old ways with me today. Her ancestors knew how to fight the Deep Singers, using sacred stones that burn the creatures like acid. The stones must be ground into powder and mixed with spring water from sources untouched by the contamination. But the ceremony requires great sacrifice. Someone must carry the poison directly to the source. The bumps have appeared on my neck. I know what this means. Marcus will try to stop me if he learns what I'm planning, but someone must act before more people die. The medicine woman has given me the location of the sacred stones. If I can reach them before the creatures complete their hold on me, perhaps I can still save our town. Doc's tears fell onto the aged paper as he realized the truth. Sarah hadn't died randomly. She had deliberately infected herself to serve as a vector for destroying the organisms at their source. Her final trip to gather wildflowers had actually been a mission to collect the mineral compounds needed to poison the creature's breeding ground. But something had gone wrong. The final notes, written in Sarah's increasingly erratic handwriting, told the story of her race against time as the organisms gained control of her body and mind. June 22nd, 1854. Can't reach the sacred stones. The creatures won't let me. They're controlling my movements, forcing me back toward the well. But I've hidden the location and the ceremony instructions where Marcus will find them someday. When the creatures return, and they will return, perhaps someone braver than I am can finish what I started. Doc found the map tucked behind the last page of notes, showing the location of a canyon system about 20 miles north of Fairwater. Sarah's handwriting marked specific rock formations and described the minerals that could be used to create a compound lethal to the organisms. But accessing the location would require a dangerous journey through treacherous terrain, and the person making the trip would need to return quickly enough to apply the treatment before the creatures completed their emergence. A sound from the quarantine facility drew Doc's attention back to the present crisis. Through the window, he could see his patients moving about in the converted schoolhouse. Their movements synchronized in a way that suggested they were no longer acting as individuals. The creatures inside them were preparing for something, and time was running out. Mayor Coleman arrived as Doc was gathering Sarah's research materials, his face grim with new revelations of his own. "I need to tell you something about my family's role in all this," he said without preamble. "Something my father made me swear never to reveal." "The government reports," Doc said. "I found them. You've been filing surveillance reports for years." Coleman's shoulders sagged with relief at having the secret finally exposed. "My father told me it was the only way to protect the town. That as long as we kept the government informed about the well's status, they would send help if the situation became critical. I believed him until I received their response to my last report. They're not coming," Doc said grimly. "Worse than that, I received a coded telegram this morning. The government is planning to evacuate the surrounding territories and declare this area a biological hazard zone. They're going to abandon everyone within a 50-mile radius rather than risk the contamination spreading to major population centers." Doc felt the blood drain from his face. "How long do we have?" "The evacuation order goes into effect in 72 hours. After that, anyone remaining in the zone will be considered expendable. Military cordons will be established to prevent anyone from leaving the area." The implications were staggering. Not only would Fairwater be abandoned to face the ancient evil alone, but any survivors would be trapped in a quarantine zone that would become their tomb. The government that had created this crisis was prepared to sacrifice entire communities rather than admit their failure and take responsibility for the consequences. "There's more," Coleman continued. The telegram included intelligence about similar outbreaks at other sites throughout the territory. The well here isn't the only containment failure. There are at least 6 other locations showing signs of compromised seals. Whatever these creatures are planning, it's happening simultaneously across the entire region. Doc stared at Sarah's map, understanding finally dawning. The scattered outbreaks weren't random events. They were part of a coordinated emergence designed to overwhelm any attempt at containment. The creatures had been patient for decades, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim territory they had once dominated. "Sarah found a way to stop them," Doc said, showing Coleman the research notes. "But it requires someone to travel to these mineral deposits and return with enough compound to poison their source. And it has to be done before the creatures complete their emergence." Coleman studied the map with growing understanding. "That canyon is rough country, especially this time of year. It would take someone who knows the terrain and can travel fast." "Eli," Doc said quietly. "Even in his condition, he's the best horseman and trail guide in the territory. But asking him to make that journey when he's fighting the creature's influence, let me make the choice," a familiar voice said from the doorway. Both men turned to see Eli Granger standing in the entrance to the house. The cowboy's appearance was shocking. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality, and the phosphorescent glow of the organisms was visible beneath the surface. But his eyes, though strained with effort, still held human intelligence and determination. "I heard what you were discussing," Eli continued. his voice rough but coherent. "I can feel them in my head, trying to control my thoughts, but I'm still me for now. If there's a chance to stop this thing, then I'm the logical choice to make." The journey. "Eli, the creatures will try to prevent you from... Let them try." Eli interrupted with a ghost of his old confident smile. "I've been fighting their influence for days now. I know their patterns, know how they try to manipulate my thoughts. And I've got more reason than most to see this through. I'm the one who brought the contamination back to town by drinking from that stream." Doc studied his patient with growing respect. Despite the obvious physical deterioration and the supernatural forces at work in his body, Eli remained focused on protecting his community. It was exactly the kind of selfless courage that frontier towns like Fairwater depended on for survival. "The journey will be dangerous even under normal circumstances," Coleman warned. "And with the creatures fighting you every step of the way, then we better get moving," Eli replied. "How much time do we have before the government seals off the area?" "Less than 3 days," Doc answered. But according to Sarah's notes, the compound must be applied at the source within hours of preparation, or it loses its effectiveness. Eli nodded grimly. "Then it's a race against time. I'll need supplies, a good horse, and someone to stay with the other patients while you prepare the treatment compound." As they planned the desperate mission, Doc couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's spirit was somehow guiding their efforts. Her sacrifice 20 years ago had preserved the knowledge they needed, and her courage was inspiring another generation to risk everything for the sake of their community. But the odds were overwhelming. Even if Eli could resist the creatures' influence long enough to reach the canyon and collect the necessary minerals, he would have to race back through treacherous terrain while fighting a supernatural force that was growing stronger by the hour. And if he failed, not only would Fairwater be doomed, but the entire region would fall to an ancient evil that had been waiting centuries for its moment of triumph. The sun was setting as they finalized their preparations, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. In the quarantine facility, the infected patients had begun moving in perfect synchronization, their alien chant growing louder and more urgent. Whatever the creatures were planning, it was reaching its final phase. Doc packed his medical supplies with hands that had grown steady with purpose. Sarah's research had given them hope, but success would require courage, skill, and a measure of luck that seemed almost too much to ask for. The battle for Fairwater's survival was about to begin, and failure would mean not just the death of their community, but the awakening of horrors that could spread across the entire continent. As night fell over the frontier town, 3 determined men prepared to challenge forces that had existed since before human civilization began. It was a battle they couldn't afford to lose, because losing would mean the end of everything they held dear. The ancient cave paintings were the first sign that Eli had reached the right location. Despite the creature's increasing attempts to cloud his thoughts and turn him back toward Fairwater, he had managed to navigate the treacherous canyon terrain using Sarah's detailed map. The paintings covered the walls of a shallow cave about halfway up the canyon's north face. Primitive figures depicting humans in battle with writhing, serpentine forms that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the organisms now infesting his body. Dr. Hutchinson's injection apparatus had been hidden in the old clinic's basement, exactly where the government documents had indicated. The device was unlike anything Doc had seen in conventional medical practice. A brass and steel contraption designed to deliver large volumes of treatment directly into deep water sources. It had clearly been engineered specifically for dealing with the creatures in their aquatic environment, complete with pressure gauges and reinforced delivery tubes that could penetrate significant depths. Eli's condition had deteriorated dramatically during the 20-mile journey to the canyon. The phosphorescent glow beneath his skin had grown brighter, and he could feel the creatures moving with increasing agitation as he drew closer to the mineral deposits they instinctively feared. Several times during the ride, he had found his hands attempting to turn his horse back toward town without his conscious direction, forcing him to maintain constant vigilance against the aliens' influence over his actions. The mineral extraction proved to be the most challenging part of the mission. Sarah's notes had described specific rock formations that contained the compounds needed to create an effective poison against the organisms. The ancient Native American petroglyphs provided additional guidance, showing precisely which stones had been used by previous generations to combat the deep singers in their underground lairs, working with hands that trembled from both physical weakness and supernatural interference. Eli carefully collected samples of the crystalline formations that Sarah had identified. The minerals had an unusual quality that seemed to repel the creatures inside him. When he touched the stones, the organisms would recoil, creating pockets of blessed relief from their constant presence in his thoughts. But the extraction process was exhausting work for someone in his condition. The creatures fought him at every step, causing sudden dizzy spells and moments of disorientation designed to make him lose his footing on the treacherous canyon walls. Twice he nearly fell from the rock face, saved only by his lifetime of experience in dangerous terrain and the stubborn determination that had made him a successful trail boss. As he worked, Eli became aware that the cave paintings were telling a story that paralleled his own desperate mission. The ancient artists had recorded their ancestors' battle against the same creatures, showing warriors carrying sacred stones into underground caverns while tribal shamans performed ceremonies designed to drive the entities back into whatever dimension had spawned them. One painting in particular caught his attention. It depicted a figure very much like himself, clearly ill and infected with the writhing forms, but carrying the sacred stones into a deep cavern while other figures waited above. The infected warrior was shown descending into the earth, while supernatural light emanated from the stones he carried. And the final panel showed him emerging transformed, no longer carrying the parasitic forms, but glowing with a different kind of light altogether. The implications were sobering. The ancient ceremony didn't just involve poisoning the creatures at their source. It required someone infected with the organisms to serve as a delivery system, using their connection to the collective intelligence to ensure the compound reached every part of the underground network. It was a suicide mission disguised as a rescue operation, but Eli had suspected as much from the beginning. Sarah's sacrifice 20 years ago had pointed toward this moment, and he understood now why she had deliberately infected herself before attempting to reach the sacred stones. The person who carried the poison into the creature's domain would not be coming back out alive. With his saddlebags filled with the precious minerals, Eli began the dangerous journey back toward Fairwater. The creatures inside him were becoming increasingly frantic, their movements causing waves of pain that made it difficult to stay conscious in the saddle. They seemed to understand what he was carrying and were marshaling all their influence to prevent him from completing his mission. The ride back became a constant battle of wills. The organisms would cloud his vision at crucial moments, cause his hands to shake when he needed to guide his horse around dangerous obstacles, and fill his mind with compelling visions of turning toward the well instead of returning to town. But Eli had spent his lifetime dealing with uncooperative animals and treacherous conditions, and he drew on every reserve of stubbornness and determination to keep moving in the right direction. As the lights of Fairwater came into view, Eli felt the creatures inside him make one final, desperate attempt to assert control. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, as if every cell in his body was being torn apart from within. But he could also sense their fear. They knew that their ancient dominion was about to end, and they were terrified of the oblivion that awaited them. Doc and Coleman were waiting at the clinic when Eli arrived, their faces showing the strain of the hours they had spent preparing for the final phase of their desperate plan. The injection apparatus had been assembled and tested, and Doc had prepared the chemical solutions needed to activate the mineral compound according to Sarah's careful instructions. Time was running out. The quarantine patients had reached the final stages of their transformation, and reports were coming in of similar coordinated activity at the other compromised sites throughout the territory. Whatever the creatures were planning, it was about to begin unless 3 determined men could complete a mission that had claimed the life of the bravest woman any of them had ever known. The descent into the well system was like entering the throat of some ancient, malevolent god. Doc, Coleman, and Eli lowered themselves through the compromised concrete, seal into a darkness that seemed to pulse with its own evil intelligence. Their lanterns cast wavering circles of light that revealed walls covered with the same phosphorescent organisms they had been fighting. But here, the creatures existed in their natural form, vast colonies that stretched as far as their lights could reach. The injection apparatus proved its worth immediately. Dr. Hutchinson's device was designed for exactly this kind of environment, with reinforced components that could operate in the high-pressure, contaminated conditions they encountered in the flooded passages. Doc had spent hours preparing the mineral compound according to Sarah's specifications, combining the sacred stones with chemical activators that would make the poison deadly to the organisms while remaining relatively harmless to human tissue. But navigating the underground network proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. The passages twisted and branched in ways that defied mapping, creating a labyrinthine system that seemed designed to trap and disorient intruders. Worse still, the creatures reacted violently to their presence, causing the walls themselves to writhe and shift as the organisms attempted to block their progress. Eli's condition deteriorated rapidly in the creature's native environment. The organisms inside his body became hyperactive in proximity to their source, causing him to double over in agony as they prepared for their final emergence. But his connection to their collective intelligence also provided an unexpected advantage. He could sense the direction of the main colony, guiding their small party through the maze of passages toward their ultimate destination. "This way," Eli gasped, pointing toward a passage that seemed to glow with an inner light. "I can feel them calling." The main colony is just ahead. The central chamber, when they finally reached it, defied every expectation. Instead of a simple cave or underground pool, they found themselves in a vast cathedral-like space that stretched beyond the reach of their lanterns. The walls were covered with organisms that had grown into complex, almost architectural formations, creating structures that suggested intelligence and purpose far beyond simple biological functions. At the center of the chamber lay a pool of water that seemed to glow with its own phosphorescent light. The liquid moved with currents that had nothing to do with external forces, forming patterns that hurt the eyes to watch directly. This was the source, the breeding ground where the ancient creatures had waited for decades, preparing for their coordinated emergence across the territory. But what made Doc's blood run cold was the realization that the chamber wasn't empty. Suspended in alcoves around the walls were dozens of human forms in various stages of transformation. Some were recent victims from the current outbreak who had been compelled to return to the source. Others appeared to be decades old, mummified, remains that had been preserved in the creature's service for reasons that didn't bear contemplating. Among them, Doc recognized faces from the 1854 outbreak. People he had failed to save, who had apparently been drawn back to this place in their final moments to serve some purpose in the creature's incomprehensible plan. The sight filled him with a combination of rage and determination that gave him strength for what had to be done. "Sarah," he whispered, recognizing his wife's form in one of the alcoves. But there was no time for grief. Eli had collapsed near the edge of the phosphorescent pool, his body convulsing as the creatures inside him prepared for their final emergence. The organisms were no longer trying to control his actions. Instead, they were abandoning his failing form to join the massive colony in the central pool. "Do it now," Eli managed to say through gritted teeth. While they're distracted by the emergence process, Doc activated the injection apparatus, watching as the mineral compound began flowing through the reinforced tubes toward the pool's depths. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The phosphorescent glow began to dim as the poison spread through the water, and the walls of the chamber echoed with sounds that seemed to come from no earthly creature, a keening wail of pain and rage that spoke of intelligence facing its own extinction. The creatures fought back with desperate fury. The water in the central pool began to boil and churn, sending waves of contaminated liquid splashing toward the three men. The organisms on the walls detached themselves and swarmed toward the source of their torment, but the poison was spreading faster than they could contain it. Eli made his final sacrifice as the chamber filled with the creature's death throes. Using the last of his strength, he threw himself into the central pool, carrying additional mineral compound directly into the heart of the colony. The effect was catastrophic for the organisms. Their collective scream of agony reverberated through the entire cave system as their ancient intelligence finally faced dissolution. Doc and Coleman barely escaped the collapsing chamber as the creature's death throes brought down sections of the cavern ceiling. Behind them, the phosphorescent glow was fading rapidly, replaced by ordinary darkness as the ancient evil that had plagued the territory for countless generations finally met its end. Eli Granger's sacrifice had broken the creature's hold on the region, but the cost of victory would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The cowboy's courage had saved countless lives, but his loss left a wound in Fairwater's heart that would never fully heal. 6 months after the creature's destruction, Fairwater had begun the slow process of healing from wounds that went far deeper than anyone outside the community could understand. The memorial stone stood in the town's central square, its granite surface bearing the names of all those who had been lost to the ancient evil Sarah Avery, Eli Granger, and the 11 victims from the 1854 outbreak whose sacrifice had finally been acknowledged and honored. Doc Avery knelt beside the memorial on a crisp autumn morning, placing fresh wildflowers at its base, as he had done every day since the stone was dedicated. The flowers were the same variety Sarah had been gathering 20 years ago when she first became infected, deliberate choice that transformed a symbol of tragedy into one of remembrance and hope. "She would have been proud of what you accomplished," said a gentle voice behind him. Doc turned to see Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a young physician who had arrived from the territorial capital 3 months ago. She had come to Fairwater specifically because of the story that had emerged from the crisis, a story that had finally forced the government to acknowledge its role in creating the disaster and take responsibility for the consequences. "I didn't save her," Doc replied, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of grief. "I failed her when she needed me most." "You honored her sacrifice," Dr. Morrison corrected gently. "Her research saved not just Fairwater, but every other community in the territory that was facing the same threat. The government has sealed 12 other compromised sites using the methods she developed. Hundreds of lives have been preserved because of what she discovered." It was true, though Doc still struggled to find comfort in the knowledge. The public revelation of the government's secret research program had caused a scandal that reached all the way to Washington, forcing officials to acknowledge the existence of Project Underground and take immediate action to address the remaining contaminated sites. But no amount of official apologies could bring back the people who had died because of bureaucratic arrogance and secrecy. The transformation of Fairwater itself had been remarkable to witness. Instead of being abandoned as a contaminated zone, the town had become a center for research into biological threats and environmental protection. Young scientists and medical professionals like Dr. Morrison were drawn to the community by its reputation for facing impossible challenges with courage and determination. Mayor Coleman had used the government's guilt and compensation payments to modernize the town's infrastructure while preserving its frontier character. New buildings rose alongside the old, creating a blend of tradition and progress that honored the past while preparing for the future. The population had grown for the first time in decades, as families arrived seeking the kind of community that had proven its strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. But perhaps the most important changes were the ones that couldn't be seen from the outside. The secrets and lies that had poisoned relationships for generations had been swept away, replaced by an understanding that truth, no matter how difficult, was preferable to comfortable deception. Town meetings that had once focused on mundane administrative matters now addressed complex questions about science, ethics, and the responsibilities that came with knowledge. Doc's medical practice had evolved as well. Dr. Morrison's arrival had allowed him to step back from the day-to-day demands of being Fairwater's only physician, giving him time to document the lessons learned from their battle against the ancient organisms. His detailed case studies were being used by researchers throughout the country to develop protocols for identifying and treating similar biological threats. The leather medical journal that had served him for 40 years now contained a complete record of humanity's encounter with intelligence from an earlier age. The final entries told the story of courage triumphing over fear, of ordinary people rising to face extraordinary challenges, and of communities that refused to be destroyed by forces beyond their understanding. The children who play in that square will never know how close they came to losing everything, Dr. Morrison observed, watching as a group of young people ran laughing past the memorial stone. "That's exactly as it should be," Doc replied. "Their innocence is what we were fighting to preserve." A delegation from the territorial government had visited Fairwater the previous month, offering Doc a position as head of the new Department of Biological Security they were establishing in response to the crisis. He had declined, choosing instead to remain in the community where he had built his life and learned the most important lessons about service and sacrifice. His evening walks now took him past the sealed valley where the ancient well had once posed its terrible threat. The area had been transformed into a memorial garden, with paths winding among native plants that thrived in soil no longer poisoned by supernatural contamination. A small chapel stood where the well had been located, providing a place for quiet reflection on the mysteries of existence and the courage required to face them. Standing at Sarah's grave as the sun set over the prairie, Doc finally felt the peace that had eluded him for 20 years. Her marker bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of her character. She died so others might live, and her courage lights the way for those who follow. The town that had been built over a secret was now a beacon of hope, proving that truth and determination could overcome any darkness. Fairwater had faced the ancient evil and emerged stronger, its people bound together by shared sacrifice and common purpose. As Doc walked home through streets filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors sharing the concerns of ordinary life, he whispered a prayer of gratitude to his wife and to Eli Granger, whose courage had made this peaceful evening possible. The ancient evil was gone, but their memory would endure as long as people valued the light over the darkness. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost, and some victories were worth any sacrifice required to achieve them. Fairwater had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, and its people would never forget the price of freedom from fear.